Hello, everybody.
What's up, dude?
Not much. It's a beautiful day here in Kansas City, Missouri. We're coming at you guys live with a super special, exciting interview today, one we've really been anticipating.
Yeah, this is one. Obviously, we're going to be talking to the Briahna Joy Gray, former press secretary for Bernie Sanders, current co-host of the Bad Faith podcast. Obviously somebody that needs no introduction in this sphere. So we're super stoked about that. But yeah, to echo the sentiment about the weather, it has been really fucking nice in Kansas City, which is great because it snowed last week and was really cold and rainy in the middle of what was supposed to be spring, I thought.
Right.
So yeah, really nice to have like a 70-degree sunny day. I went to the farmer's market this morning with my girlfriend, did that kind of thing. It was very nice to get outside, now that I'm vaccinated,
right,
that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And huge shout out to our patrons. Thanks so much to everyone supporting the show. We've been having some great guests lately, some really fantastic conversations. And some of those conversations our patrons get to see first. So, there's some really cool benefits you can find out about at the link in the description. That's patreon.com/the Vanguard channel. If you want to support the show, that's one way to do it. We also have a PayPal link in the description if you want to donate to help, fuel some of our more ambitious documentary content coming down the line. We're going to be taking our Sprinter van on the street soon, within a few months here. Honestly, we're getting to that point. So to create some documentary style content, some really cool shit for you guys that you're going to
we'll be putting a trailer together for everybody to check out. That'll probably come out the first week of June. We're going to do some trial runs, tests, that kind of thing, put out a proof of concept together. Essentially, that should be due out the first week of June. We're pretty stoked for that. And then it'll just start to a lot more actual kind of documentary style content. Obviously, Gavin and I are super relieved and grateful to be vaccinated and able to get back out on the road and actually start, making some serious content and not just speculating, which we'll continue to do. Don't worry. But
sure. Oh yeah, the content's not going anywhere, guys. It's just going to increase in volume. But I guess we can get to the interview. Obviously, Briahna Joy Gray, as you said, former press secretary, Bernie Sanders, just one of the most articulate, intelligent voices on the left, which is probably why she pisses off so many people, not only on the right, but on the left too. Yeah, exactly. But we can introduce her. What's up? How's it going? Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
This is awesome.
I object. I've never pissed a single person off. I'm universally beloved.
Neither has the Vanguard.
Not a controversial bone in my body.
Well, it's funny because I always think that, most of your arguments are pretty rational. They come from a pretty intellectual place. They're not reactionary. But for some reason, not just, you, but Bad Faith in general seems to be this lightning rod for controversy, especially with Twitter libs and stuff like that. We saw your tweet the other day getting randomly pillared by people for some reason. I find it bizarre, honestly.
Which one? Look, it happens. It's kind of the price of admission. And for the most part, I don't let it bother me too much. I feel really privileged to be in a position to be heard when I say things. And, it was a long time coming. I'm someone who was a completely anonymous tweeter in 2015, 2016. I think I got my 500th follower New Year's Eve of 2017. So I'm happy to have a little bit of leverage in the posting wars, even if it comes with a little bit of downside.
Yeah, that's hilarious. Well, I guess a good question to start with is one that I had, and I've been, thinking about trying to come up with an answer or the proper way forward. And I feel like you're someone that can maybe offer us some logic in this sense. And I guess it just seems like a lot of us here on the left are feeling less optimistic than ever right now about electoral politics. And obviously there's very valid reasons for that. Those of us who those who were elected to crusade for us in Washington, D.C. have more or less joined what they used to resist. And at least that's the way I am seeing things. And even Bernie Sanders has, kind of essentially done the same, opting to hopefully affect incremental progressive change via influencing Biden, but, certainly not really leading the charge for radical reforms anymore necessarily. But that being said, something that is undeniable about the Bernie Sanders campaign for president in 2020 or in 2016 and 2020 is that it's really the reason why there are as many socialists right now in this country, in this movement. Bernie obviously exploded the membership of DSA. His campaign obviously sparked this massive new kind of genre of lefty independent media, which our show certainly falls within. And even if there's valid criticisms of DSA or of, the lefty independent media space, I think we can agree that it's better that they're here than not here. That this conversation and this movement is happening in any sense, thanks to the campaign of Bernie Sanders and also, some of the squad members even. So I'm just wondering, obviously, even if it is a purely chaotic mission, even if it's bound to fail, I still think the left must present a real challenge to Biden-Harris in 2024, if for no other reason than to keep alive this movement and to keep alive interest in lefty ideas. And I'm just wondering if you agree with that assessment of the benefits of electoralism, specifically relating to our movement at this point in time.
Yeah, I think the growing pains that people are going through right now, and I'm certainly going through as well, is that through the Bernie campaign in particular, a lot of the ideological goals that folks on the left had had for a long time found concrete voice in what seemed like real possibility. So before Bernie, I might have believed healthcare is a human right and that we should have Medicare for all, but I felt like a nut job to say that kind of thing out loud, given our political context, right? And so what Bernie did is he gave us permission to actually believe in and fight for a number of things that I think have always been shared values as a progressive community, and in fact, a majority of Americans. And when that campaign ended, those expectations, that confidence in our belief system didn't go away, even if the kind of direct electoral possibilities in the short term started to look more vague. And I think that's what's going on when you see this conversation that's been happening over the last week or so, where there's been a glut of articles announcing that Joe Biden has exceeded everybody's expectations, that the progressives are very happy with him, et cetera. It doesn't take into account the fact that regardless of what Joe Biden has been historically and what one might expect of him because of who he's always been, the moment demands so much more. And our ability to articulate that and demand that shouldn't change just because Joe Biden's set the bar so low. And it's our job as the left to continue to keep that spark of possibility alive and keep the public understanding that if they demand more, they can get more, and not to set their own expectations and political demands back at Joe Biden levels.
Yeah, it's really interesting, kind of the whole Joe Biden phenomenon, at least how the media has kind of dealt with him, because you look at the pre-election stuff, right? And we were all being peddled this like, oh, Joe Biden's the next FDR. He's going to be a hugely progressive president, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, after the election, after he actually gets into power, that tune entirely changes. I remember Matt Iglesias, before the election, he literally wrote a piece in the headline saying Joe Biden was going to be the next FDR. And like a month and a half after the election, he wrote a piece saying Joe Biden never was a progressive, never said he was a progressive. And it's just like, it's maddening, right? And so now you have people like AOC who are going out there and kind of validating this argument that, like, yes, he has actually overcome and he's done some sort of battling when all he has done is constantly capitulate. He's sold out the working class. He didn't even get the $2,000 checks that were promised, let the minimum wage increase. He hasn't gotten back in the Iran deal. Overseas, it's been a disaster. So, I mean, there's really not even a single thing to congratulate him for other than the fact that he wasn't just a buffoon like Donald Trump when handling the vaccine rollout. And there are tremendous numbers of problems with our vaccine rollout that aren't getting addressed because everybody wants to, celebrate him for actually getting people vaccinated and addressing that there's a problem in America. But we're creating an even bigger problem by hoarding vaccines and not actually distributing them equitably throughout the third and developing world. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, in the primary, in the general election, rather, he's better than Trump was an argument to vote for Joe Biden. But it was coupled with, but we're going to make sure that he's better, period, that we're going to push him left once he's elected. And what's so frustrating is seeing that he's better than Trump is still the bar by which he's being judged, no matter that we are in a post-pandemic America where 15 million people lost their employer-based health insurance because of unemployment, no matter that unemployment numbers are still incredibly high and Black unemployment numbers are even higher than that. And Joe Biden painted himself as a candidate that was kind of uniquely uniquely responsive to the Black community. And in fact, if you didn't want to vote for Biden or hadn't yet decided who you're going to vote for, you were not Black. So, I think that's the real frustration. And what it feels like, what has been explicit from some progressives even, is that Joe Biden isn't behind this. We're not going to fight for it. There was an interview, I believe, with Ilhan Omar and Mehdi Hassan maybe a month or so ago, where, she kind of in a resigned way says, look, it became clear that he wasn't going to back a $15 minimum wage. So that was that. And what I would hope is that there was an understanding that the power that progressive figures have is not inside the House. It's not by playing nice and negotiating with figures like Nancy Pelosi, who are not motivated by how kind you are to her across the conference table or whatever plaudits you send her way on the internet. That's not how power works. There's an enormous amount of power that comes from the pressures that can come from the people. And these enormously popular congresswomen who have more financial freedom than most members of Congress, because they're so popular and are able to raise so much grassroots money, you really feel empowered by that and take some stands at these crucial inflection points we've seen already this year. Force the vote, of course, and the $15 minimum wage is another one. And now we're having a conversation about all these huge, important, massively important bills coming down the pike, like the PRO Act, that are contingent on the filibuster to pass. And it feels like that is a pressure point that's not getting enough pressure put on it either. And in fact, as we saw in the past few days, even having a discussion about why we're not talking more about filibuster reform has created a sort of division among the left, which has been really interesting to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. To get back a little bit to my comment earlier regarding your tweet, you ruffled some feathers, like I mentioned, by merely just stating that for what it's worth, Biden has not exceeded my expectations. And needless to say, he has not exceeded mine either. And I wouldn't be terribly impressed with him until I see some actual reforms to the system, not just these kind of one-time Band-Aids that the press will then shower him in congratulations for and act like it's the same thing as passing a real institutional reform. And something that's enraged me incessantly here at the Vanguard, but no one else seems to be talking about, is the fact that Joe Biden unilaterally took legalizing cannabis out of the Democratic Party platform, maddeningly, because the rest of the entire party was on board, not just Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang's of the race, but also more centrist characters like Cory Booker and even Kamala Harris, the VP right now. Obviously, 40,000 Americans are currently incarcerated because of the war on cannabis. 1/5 of the prison population is basically drug offenders in the countries, in the world's most incarcerated country here in America. And it's directly because of policies like Biden's 94 crime bill. So just considering the Democratic Party consensus around the issue of legalization and frankly, the bipartisan consensus around this issue, I figured there would have been at least some pushback from the left, the people in Congress and the Senate that are on the left. I figured there would have been more pushback and a little bit more resistance to this unilateral decision to remove the bipartisan goal from his agenda. But I have yet to see a single peep. I mean, maybe I missed it, but I haven't seen any outrage over this. And Biden, he doesn't need Manchin's permission. He doesn't need the parliamentarian. He wouldn't have to abolish the filibuster. Why do you think there hasn't been more resistance to this continued drug war?
Well, for one, I mean, there's a kind of cynical response, but practically speaking, I think that Biden has been effective in designing relief valves so that if he gets a certain kind of criticism, he can to something like, well, we have a commission plan to study the harm that might be caused by cannabis use. Right. There are all of these pivots. And the fact of a parliamentarian and frankly, the fact of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema as these outlier votes remain a kind of release valve that the Biden administration can pivot to whenever he does get a hard, good, legitimate question. You saw this, there are those who are arguing that the parliamentarians saying that we're going to have another reconciliation opportunity as a way to take pressure off of the conversation about the filibuster. Okay, Biden has his back up against the wall because it's difficult for anybody to ignore, whatever their political preferences are, that his entire administration is going to be defined by Joe Manchin unless he gets rid of the filibuster. So to avoid those difficult questions, now suddenly, all right, well, at least we have another reconciliation period. Let's see what we can get done. And the can just keeps getting kicked off the road. And if you are not kind of doggedly keeping your eye on the prize, you can get fooled pretty easily. And I think most journalists are very overwhelmed, underfunded, and not tracking these things in quite the same way. And that, frankly, was some of my concern around the way the push for the PRO Act is being characterized. It is enormously important. And because it's so important, I think it's important for us not to pretend that Joe Manchin coming on board and inching us closer to the 50 votes that Chuck Schumer says will prompt him to bring the PRO Act to the floor for a vote isn't actually winning in any meaningful way if you don't have a plan to get either 10 Republican votes, which is a pretty pie in the sky expectation, or getting rid of the filibuster or moving to the talking filibuster, whatever filibuster reform these kind of moderates are willing to embrace. And so if we really care about the PRO Act, which I think we all absolutely should, we need to be talking about all of those issues concurrently, or else you will allow a neoliberal mainstream media to frame as wins, great progressive wins for Biden and the left, things that they ultimately know aren't going to result in the passage of laws.
Yeah. But what about things like cannabis that don't even need the Joe Manchin vote?
I cannot. I'm sorry, Gavin. I can't explain. I can't justify why journalists and nobody seems to care, and why these progressive politicians don't seem to care. I'm as baffled and frustrated by it as you are. I do not know. Yeah. Look, especially in a world where the 2020 was largely defined by the largest protest movement in American history that was centered around issues of criminal justice and police excess in particular, that Biden only got elected on the basis, as every Democrat does, of getting Black votes to turn out. In particular, he wouldn't have the Senate without the efforts of particularly Black organizers in the state of Georgia and voters there as well. And yet there is no outrage. Look, we also saw during that leaked call from last fall that I keep talking about, but which the media very quickly forgot about, that Sherrilyn Ifill, specifically asked Joe Biden about pushing for several criminal justice reform efforts, many of which I think were part of the George Floyd Act, that he could do by executive order. And Joe Biden's very Biden-style response was to say that he didn't want to pass laws by executive order as a matter of principle, an undefined principle, a principle that doesn't really make sense to all of the, tens and hundreds of thousands of Americans who are locked up because of these petty drug crimes. And instead pivoted the conversation to how we shouldn't talk about defund the police because that was going to lose us Georgia. So not only ignoring what he really could do in his own individual capacity with executive authority, but then going and using the moment to bully all of the civil rights leaders on the call about not picking up one of the strident clarion calls for justice that was being made at the time. That's who we have as the president of the United States. But because of the cover that's being provided by the corporate media at the moment, what we get instead is articles about how he's exceeding expectations and is the next FDR.
Yeah, obviously it's maddening. I guess this kind of leads me into a question that I had for you. You were, as somebody who was, very intimately involved in the Sanders campaign, and obviously it's so easy to hindsight's 2020, right? No pun intended. But everybody wants to sit back and critique the Bernie Sanders campaign for what he did or what he didn't do or whatever. And obviously, none of us were there. You were there. And so I just kind of wanted to ask you if you think that there's any merit to the criticism that he should have run as an independent in 2020. After he'd been basically, fucking cheated in 2016. And not only that, and I guess the main reason I asked that is because it seems like the movement is so disparate now. We were all able to unite behind Senator Sanders' presidential run, it seemed like, regardless of kind of where you were in the new factions of the left that have seemingly been drawn since the end of the primaries. We were all able to, kind of hold hands and be like, okay, we have a single mission to do. It was almost like a busy kitchen. Everybody sets aside their personal beef and just, gets the orders out. And I'm wondering if you think that had he run as an independent or under some other party banner, we would have been able to remain some of that collectivity and that collective spirit now that the Sanders campaign is no more.
As an from an uninformed, just observer's place, I think that would have been dope. I think that there may be some implications in terms of access to debates and other kinds of things that might have been disadvantageous for him had he done so. And I think that those were considerations, but those aren't conversations that I was privy to, and I don't have any particular insight into them. So I don't want to kind of speak out of turn.
Sure.
I think that the fact of him being a registered independent for his political career was sometimes framed by, again, the corporate media as a deficit, but was a real asset to him. I found myself in a debate recently with a Republican, with Buck Sexton, on his show with Mark Lamont Hill. And Buck Sexton immediately came out of the gate saying Democrats are horrible and aren't Democrats awful. And I was like, I'm no fan. I work for the Independent from Vermont. And he really didn't know where to go from there, because I mean, I frankly think there's a reason why a majority of Americans identify as neither Democrat nor independent. And there's a lot of power in an argument that the real divisions in this country are top down and not red, blue, or left and right. I think there was another component of your question that I'm
just wondering, in your view, moving forward, now that the left is so fractured and disparate, and we've all kind of begun, I mean, with good reason too. I don't want to pretend that calling out people's bad strategies and pointing out that somebody's running cover for somebody who's not doing their job. We do that here. Obviously, I'm not taking shots at people who are doing that, but that has fractured the left. We no longer have our eye on a single prize, and I'm just wondering, how do we get back to that?
Yeah. So for one, I do think that sometimes the narrative of how unified we were before the end of Bernie's race is a little overstated. There was Elizabeth Warren. Yeah. There were a lot of Elizabeth Warren supporters, and there were a lot of people who are still, on the broad left who were supporters of hers, who wrote articles advocating for her candidacy throughout the primary in highly respected left magazines that I read and respect, like Jacobin. A lot of members of our DSA community, did support her. So I don't mean that as an indictment, but the reality is that there has always been a diversity of opinion that has caused some vulnerabilities to the possibility of actually getting a socialist elected president in this country. And I think it's, naive to think that all of that is going to go away. Now, I would love to be in a left media environment where we could disagree without some of the really disappointing and frankly hurtful ugliness that comes around these disagreements. I would prefer to be able to point out a simple strategic vulnerability that exists in not talking about how we're actually going to pass the PRO Act without the filibuster, without filibuster reform, without being accused of hating labor and hating the PRO Act. Because unlike opponents of Force the Vote who wanted Force the Vote to fail, I would love for the PRO Act to pass and would love to be proven wrong, and would love for 10 Republicans to pop up tomorrow saying that they are for it, and to be sitting here with egg on my face, right? And I'm in supportive of every effort there. And one has to start to ask why it is that people are so sensitive and so defensive that we aren't able to talk across communities, and why it does feel like there are all of these balkanized communities on the left where I, as a DSA member, am kind of framed as being anti-DSA. The first time I popped into in NDC DSA meeting, after I tweeted about it, I was excited. Oh, I'm going to go to my first, meeting today. And then when I popped into the Slack chat, I saw people that had grabbed my tweet and put it in there, were making fun of that, making fun of the fact that I was going to join. So that's kind of the spirit that I have encountered as I am actively trying to participate in and commune with people who are supposed to be my comrades. And I hope everyone, no matter how frustrated they've been by Force the Vote or some of the other disagreements that have been going on, can really understand that you cannot have a movement that's predicated on solidarity and shared interests if you're going to disagree with the level of venom that's been going on.
Yeah, do you have any comment or opinion on the state of the DSA right now? Because from my opinion, or from my perspective, it seems like there's a lot of really good work being done on the local level, but maybe there's a disconnect with the national leadership, kind of like we see in a lot of unions, frankly. Does that kind of sound like an accurate analysis to you?
Well, look, I think the DSA is an enormous organization, to its credit. It's grown by leaps and bounds. And I think that that's its real strength and why it's such a boon, right? And so people are so proud of it. And there's a lot of diversity of opinion within it. Like a lot of organizations, my understanding is that there's sometimes divides that happen between leadership and rank and file. And I think Force the Vote revealed the extent to which, like a lot of organizations, no particular slight to DSA, there are kind of organizational barriers to taking a quick pulse of what's going on or what the views are of its constituencies so that it can be responsive to the group. And that's something that I hear is being worked on subsequent to kind of the frustrations around Force the Vote in January. And I'm very glad to hear that. I think that DSA differs from an organization like Socialist Alternative because they do welcome people across an ideological spectrum, and there are no kind of ideological litmus tests to join the organization. And when I went to investigate, Socialist Alternative out of curiosity after we interviewed Shama Swant, and she was so persuasive, I thought, I'll just go to the website and I'll set my donation and I'll be a member of Socialist Alternative too. And that's not how it works. They call you and there's a series of meetings and conversations and readings to talk about what you believe in. And that results in a different kind of organization, which has different kinds of strengths, and that again is not an indictment. I think there's good reasons to be members of a lot of different membership organizations. But I think that we, as members of these groups, should be willing to talk about their vulnerabilities in an effort to make them all better and to make our goals our shared goals as democratic socialists more achievable.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Gavin and I have been extremely impressed by Socialist Alternative. And, Gavin's pointed out that Shama Swant may be the most effective elected person in America right now as far as what she's been able to accomplish as a sitting city councilwoman. And it really makes you think, what could our Congress people be doing? What could our senators be doing? What could our, executive branch politicians be doing if they were actually fighting and strategizing like Shama Swant is in Seattle? And I'm wondering if a little bit about, you said you looked into their process a little bit more. One of the things I know about Socialist Alternative is that they actually make the candidates give, or if they're elected, they give up a portion of their salary, and it goes back to Socialist Alternative to keep them really rooted in that working class fight. If you are going to, i.e., be a public servant, you are going to serve the public, and you will know what a median salary feels like, and the pressures that come with that, and the constraints, and all of the anxieties and whatever. You're actually plugged into representing that specific community. I think that sounds like a really sound strategy, especially when you look at how skeptical people are, and when you look at the economic divide, and we look at the immense history of the United States, where we pay our Congress people like 3 times the median salary of the American working people, and it obviously creates a disconnect because then they have their per diems and they have all these fancy dinners and they get showered in the life of the opulent, and they feel like they're a part of that instead of the working class. So, would you like to see that? Adopted by more progressives, that kind of idea? Do you think that that's effective, or do you think that there are other ways to keep people grounded without, messing with their living standard?
I mean, I think it's incredibly admirable. I think it's effective, but at the risk of sounding out of touch or maybe naive myself, the $175,000 congressional salary compared to the millions that these people make because they can trade on the stock market and get paid in kind in a million different other ways. What is there, like 1 or 2 people in Congress who aren't millionaires? Nancy Pelosi is worth how many dozens of millions of dollars?
And she's doubled her wealth so many times since being in office. Just between 2008, we just had a reporter, Robbie Jager, on to talk about this. She went from having like a net worth of $30 million, and now it's over $100 million in like 12 years.
Right. So, it's not that I don't think the salary is an issue, but compared to all of the wealth that comes through other means, that would be my focus. So why it is that you can be a sitting member of Congress and still trade on the stock market, I haven't a clue, or your spouses or family members and all those other kinds of things.
Run
I
hedge
haven't
funds.
a clue.
Yeah.
Run hedge funds. And the thing is, there's also, I think, a great deal of what's happening in terms of why progressives are not necessarily behaving in the ways that they behaved before they were elected or in their early days, right? Because what we're talking about when we say someone has been bought or corrupted or whatever language you want to use, it's not kind of an abstraction. We're saying that these were statements that were made by these figures before they were elected or soon after elected, where they said it's ridiculous that we've never had a floor vote on Medicare for all, where they said, I'd rather take an unpopular position with my party and only be a one-term congressperson. They've said these things, and now their behavior is demonstrating something different. And I think obviously money and opportunities, that very well might be a part of it. But another, I think, bigger part of it is the psychology of thinking, oh, I'm in here now and I can make a difference no matter how small. And that I'm face to face with my constituents every day. I see the million tiny decisions that get made. And sure, I might not have gotten a $15 minimum wage, but it's better that I'm here doing this work than someone else is here who's not doing that work. And they're seeing trade-offs that are opaque to us, but that feel very real to them, and let them feel justified in their decision. And I think it's incumbent on us to kind of broaden that worldview to where it was before they got into office, and continue to put pressure on these elected members of Congress, because I think it can get easy to get sucked into the idea that the sacrifices you're making are better than getting nothing. And that if you don't hold out, if you're not willing to be adversarial, if you're not willing to take any risks, and if you're not willing to trust that the public that got you elected will have your back, if you fight for the harder thing, the thing that's going to get you blowback from the media, the thing that's going to get you negative campaign ads, that we are going to be here to compensate for whatever money you lose, to lift you up, and to have your back in a way that, frankly, Nancy Pelosi and the corporate Democrats just never are going to do.
Yeah, and for me, kind of that transition has been, somewhat painful, I guess, of a realization or waking up, because, AOC really became my hero when she protested outside of Pelosi's office, introducing the Green New Deal under the Trump administration. I thought that was just probably the best way possible to enter Congress, declaring.
Yeah, it was really dope. I was there that day. It was really cool.
It was beautiful. And it seemed like the culmination of what we had been fighting, to send folks like her there to do. And I bring that up because obviously, I guess the Green New Deal was just reintroduced. Senator Ed Markey, and obviously Representatives Ocasio-Cortez and also Cori Bush, they just reintroduced this bill, but it didn't seem like it happened with much fanfare or protests happening adjacently. There was no sit-in that I was aware of, and that's despite the fact that now Biden is president and seemingly would be more sympathetic or more potentially open to passing this policy than the previous president, who didn't even believe in climate change. So I just think it's kind of a strategic. I don't understand the strategic approach of not reintroducing it with the same kind of confrontational pressure now that there is a potentially more sympathetic administration to this policy. Were you at all surprised to not see much fanfare around this?
Well, I don't know that I'm not surprised that there's not much fanfare around it. I think that we live in a world where, because there's such a resistance to being adversarial within your own party, any moment of being adversarial within your own party is met with a great deal of fanfare, right? So you don't even have to have a sit-in. I think sit-ins are great and they should do all the sit-ins. I do think that there are some constraints with COVID. I know that we were encountering this around Force the Vote, that, I mean, Congress people can invite and schedule folks to come in to Congress, but lay people don't have access. And I don't know if there are any constraints about how many people Congress members can bring in. I just don't know. But regardless, it doesn't take all that. The beauty of AOC and the power of these squad members is that they have independent media control through social media and a reach unlike any others. When AOC does a late night live stream and talks about how traumatic the experience of 1/6 was, it's on the front page of every digital media outlet the next day, right? It's trending on Twitter. And if AOC were to say something firm but true, like Joe Biden's climate goals do not meet the needs of a country that's on a planet that's on the precipice of ecological disaster, then that would be the headline of every page the next day, right? And so, I think from my perspective, at least, I won't speak for anyone but myself, there is a lot of discourse that says, you're just a podcaster and what do you know? And, AOC doesn't have all the power in the world. And of course she doesn't have all the power in the world. What's being asked is that she uses the power that she absolutely does have and what she does wield from time to time. She used that power to push for impeachment with a lot of other progressives and non-progressives.
The same argument she refused to apply to force the vote, by the way.
Force the vote, exactly. And part of why there are liberals, there are conservative Democrats who roll their eyes and are so frustrated when I say something like Biden hasn't exceeded my expectations, is because they're legitimately ignorant of the power play that happened around the $15 minimum wage. They don't know that Biden could have ignored it, overruled, fired the parliamentarian. They don't know because it was never covered and nobody said it. And they don't realize that if the $15 minimum wage had been left in the COVID bill, it would have taken an objector, let's say Joe Manchin, 60 votes to get it pulled out, which he didn't have. And that instead, it took Bernie Sanders to try to get 60 votes to put it back in, which he also didn't have. Right. And so as Joe Biden and the parliamentarian orchestrated a situation that took a 50 vote plus one vote and turned it into a 60 vote to give him cover for not pushing for the one arguably progressive, it's obviously mainstream and bipartisan, but the one progressive ask that Bernie Sanders made first and foremost as he was dropping out of the race. And then that, even if your only expectation was that Joe Biden was going to do what he told Bernie Sanders he was going to do when Bernie Sanders dropped out of the race, he has not met that expectation. And anyone saying otherwise in America in the middle of an employment crisis, a COVID crisis, an economic crisis that would be enormously benefited from a $15 minimum wage is being dishonest.
Yeah. I guess with all that in mind, what you laid out there, and and also just to add, you mentioned how wonderfully AOC and the other squad members can fundraise. We also found out that she was so charitable that she was going to give a bunch of blue dogs $5,000, whether they wanted it or not, of those donations that people thought were going to be, to fight for things like Medicare for all, like a Green New Deal, like a $15 minimum wage, like the abolishing of ICE, getting these children out of cages who haven't seen sunlight in days at times. Yet that all evaporated, right? And now it's, I need to keep. It seemed like she would have almost donated $5,000 to Joe Crowley had she been in fucking a different borough. You know what I mean? I'm serious.
Absolutely. Joe Crowley wasn't even the worst in terms of elected representatives. Yeah.
It felt like, obviously you're more seasoned and probably maybe saw this coming. It felt like a kick in the stomach. Like this was the final blow. Like, what? Especially when we talked to Eva Pitsova, who had a real fucking chance in the district, and yet her primary got a $5,000 gift from AOC. So really frustrating. And I guess in response to that, a lot of people have been sort of saying that the strategy of getting insurgent progressives into Congress has just failed. I think it was actually on bad faith that Chris Hedges said that the squad had been completely emasculated. And I'm just wondering what you would say to people who have said, fuck this, we need a new strategy because I'm not going to go knock on 1 million doors to get somebody into Congress that's going to fucking screw me in 6 months.
I don't blame them. I think it's a perfectly rational position to take. Look, my philosophy is unlike the people who disagree with force of vote. I'm not in a position where I would try to get in anybody's way. I think on balance, would I prefer there be elected representatives who at least give lip service to Medicare for all than those who don't? Yes. Would I prefer there to be more people in Congress who co-sponsor the bills that I care about and inch us closer to getting majorities? Obviously. Do I think that inside strategy is sufficient? Absolutely not. And I think that having conversations about what your support of insurgent candidates is contingent on is important to make sure that those insurgent candidates actually keep their promises once they're in office. And there isn't this expectation that because we're better than the alternative, you're always going to donate to them and you're always going to support them, et cetera, and that having them there, not fighting for us, is better than not having them there at all. I think that's a trap that we can fall into, and I don't think that that's right, because even a progressive insurgent can be placed by a more progressive insurgent that will fight harder.
Would you support that? A lot of people are going to be super pissed off if somebody runs against AOC. I support it. I've already said I don't give a shit. She's burned her bridge with me. I'm going to be honest. I don't expect much from her moving forward, and I would love to see somebody that I can expect much from get in and represent her district. But I understand that that's going to be extremely divisive.
Well, I think that AOC has said herself that she would, it's some version of I would rather be a one-term congresswoman than betray who I was when I started. Right. And what I would hope is that if that were to happen, it would help course correct AOC. Obviously she's enormously popular and anyone going up against her would face a real challenge, but I would hope that at least, a 2018 version of AOC would appreciate that as a wake-up call that could recenter her and help her, address the community that actually got her in office in the first place and make her a better candidate. It's like the people who, got all kind of squishy about Bernie Sanders tiptoeing around the idea of running against Barack Obama in 2012 symbolically. You can be mad at Bernie Sanders all day. You can say, oh my gosh, he's going up against the first Black president. Ye gods. But at the end of the day, at the time, Barack Obama was talking about cutting Social Security. And when Bernie Sanders was like, someone should run against him to prevent him from cutting Social Security, he stepped back. Right. And as progressives, I don't know how you could take the position that kind of a moment isn't a net positive for the progressive movement.
Well, I'm wondering, in a related kind of question, if there's anyone in specific that you kind of have your eye on as someone who could maybe carry on the political revolution of Bernie Sanders in 2024. And also, if you think that if they get screwed by the Democratic Party again, would you be at all supportive of the strategy of them then, redeclaring as an independent after the primary is over? Basically what people kind of accused Tulsi Gabbard of doing or planning to do. And then obviously that never happened. But, people even said that Bernie would maybe do that too.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked a lot about, I haven't written a lot of anything these days, but to the extent that I have been writing, I wrote last summer about this idea of litmus tests. And
yeah, one of my favorite
pieces. Thank you. And how if we aren't willing to draw a line in the sand at some point, if we aren't willing to say beyond this line, I will not go, if we're not willing to say to have an off ramp in the form of third parties, then we're never going to have sincere leverage in this country. I agree with all of my comrades at DSA and the broader left about how enormously important labor and the ability to withhold labor is. It's also true that we have the lowest labor density since the New Deal labor protections we got in the first instance. And that is harder to organize now than it ever has been. And that I don't think it's wrong to look in tandem to other ways to exert political leverage. And electoralism obviously has its limits, and vote withholding has its limits. But I think that has been a really underexplored area, especially when you have kind of natural constituencies like the Black vote, who have had very, very few people talking about the power of withholding both labor and literal votes around issues that are very uniformly important in the community, as demonstrated by the protests last summer. I think that, it seems apparent that a condition of Bernie running as a Democrat and getting a certain kind of treatment as a Democrat was contingent on him not doing that. Yeah. And I wrote about that a little in the litmus test piece. In the beginning of the campaign, Bernie was asked every time he went on TV, will you endorse the nominee? Now, everyone was asked a little bit. Bernie was asked to an obsessive degree. And it was clear that his ability to be in this race at all, as much as he was maligned and ignored and Bernie blacked out, he had to, the condition of him being treated at all fairly was that he pledged that he would not break off and form his own party. Now, what barriers exist to him actually doing that or reneging on a promise? I don't really know. And I don't know what kind of personal considerations a man has, or what he hopes to achieve in terms of political capital, or whether or not, having a leadership position in Congress is worth the trade-off of potentially starting that kind of a revolutionary moment in America. I am not learned enough a historian to opine, and that's why we have people on the show and I ask them these kinds of questions. And I'm like, well, what would happen, David Harvey, if Ro Khanna were replaced by Marx's brain? And what would Marx do from the inside if he were elected right now? What would happen if Bernie were to go rogue after the primary was over? Because I don't know. And I would like to be humble enough not to pretend to know the answers to those kinds of questions. But if we're not doing the thought experiment, we're potentially leaving a lot of cards on the table.
Yeah, well, one thing that I do think that is true that is not said enough when it comes to, Bernie should have been more aggressive, which is a stance that I said, and I think a lot of people felt too. But you referenced earlier that the left was split up between the Warren versus Bernie camps, and it is true that among people that vote, he really kind of needed those people. And those people might have been turned off by him going rogue or him, being more of a bomb thrower. So I do think it was a really fine line to walk. And I just have so much sympathy for the way the campaign had to handle that.
Well, look, I do think that one of the criticisms that I share, and something that I think is in contrast to the 2016 campaign, is that the corruption drum was not hit as hard in 2020.
Yeah, that is true.
And I think that part of that is because Bernie Sanders seemed to have some genuine antipathy for Hillary Clinton, which I think many Americans shared. And she was such an obviously corrupted figure. Now, Joe Biden is too. It's not just Joe Biden's 94 crime bill. It's also Joe Biden, the senator from MBNA, who's a Delaware senator who was at the helm as, the banks set up their predatory lending practices that culminated in the 2008 crash.
Yep.
As all the banks headquartering in Delaware, so they can set interest rates. All the consumer protections that were in like dozens of states are undermined by the fact that the Supreme Court held that if you register in Delaware, the Delaware law applies to the rest of the country, and on and on and on down the line. The financial crisis, which by the way, halved Black wealth and decimated home ownership values across the country in a way that people still haven't recovered from, and which fed right into the election of Donald Trump. That's Joe Biden. And the idea that none of that was really surfaced by any of the candidates, including Bernie Sanders, during the 2020 race is really galling in retrospect. On top of all of the myriad clips of Joe Biden saying horribly tone-deaf, race-related things as he was a hardcore tough on crime advocate
Good
for
friend
the entirety of this
Thurman
career, right? And then you have, I remember just before the end of the primary, you have someone like Joyanne Reid on MSNBC saying, after the last debate where Bernie tried to surface some of the stuff on Biden's record and Biden just lied about it, Joyanne Reid's response after was, who even cares about a person's record? Who even cares what happened 30 years ago? Which is a pretty, again, galling thing for a Black person in particular to say in America, who even cares what 30 years ago when we're dealing with all of the downstream effects of every single thing that happened 30 years ago and beyond. So I think that, there were these moments during the campaign, kind of famously, semi-famously, Zephyr Teachout wrote this article in The Guardian about how Joe Biden was corrupt and the campaign stepped back from it. And
another great piece.
Excellent piece. I was going on air when it came out and kind of got bombarded with questions about it and was in a position where, the campaign wanted to distance itself from it. But ultimately, I think that kind of approach would have fared well for Bernie. And obviously hindsight is 2020 and
well, I think it's
hard decisions are being made. Yeah.
When it comes to the corruption thing, I think that's absolutely correct, because a lot of Americans, even a lot of really well-intentioned or even progressive Americans that might be in the PMC class, for example, they kind of like, they know the corruption's happening, but they kind of do need it explained to them sometimes.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Just like how blatant it is occurring and how exactly it is occurring, because it's easy to just tune all that out and be like, it's part of the system. You got to do what you got to do to survive in politics, and all these rationalizations that people make. But, Zephyr Teachout's article, could have gone some way if it was more elevated by the Bernie campaign. And if that logic had been, more elevated, I think a really, really good service would have been done, not, just as far as, helping Bernie's campaign, but also just explaining these issues. I mean, if you think about it, one of the biggest boons to this movement and to this country that I think Bernie gave us was setting that standard and making people aware of the fact that this corruption is so widespread, and that we don't necessarily have to settle for it in our representatives that we send to represent us. So I think you're absolutely correct that he could have continued expounding on that line of logic and really hammering that home.
Yeah, in my experience, a lot of upper middle class PMC types, if you bring up the idea of corruption, they almost like balk, like it's a
conspiracy theory
thing to say. Like, you sound crazy. Exactly. You sound conspiratorial. Like,
is this Alex
that's like
Jones's
what mobsters
podcast?
do, right? Like, it's not what like polite company does. But you saw this in the conversation around Hillary's speeches. There was a lot of, wait, you really think that just because Hillary Clinton got $500,000 from a speech, she changed her position on this bank? It's like,
obviously.
why do you think they paid her $500,000 to speak for 20 minutes? Like,
yeah.
Or like after Obama got out of office and some
Hanging
people
out with
pointed
Richard Branson.
that he started taking those speeches and people were like, what are you saying he's not allowed to get paid afterwards?
Oh yeah, a black man gets to have his coins too, is the formulation I seem to recall. My old podcast, we did a whole thing about it. It was a very frustrating time to be alive.
Oh, on the Hear the Burn one, you mean, or the?
No, I had a anonymous little podcast on my own before I ever wrote a single article called "Someone's Wrong on the Internet."
Oh, interesting. I had no idea. That's awesome.
Well, I know we're coming up at about an hour here. One of the last questions I had for you before we get to my bonus Twin Peaks question, if we have time for it. But obviously, Gavin and I are longtime fans of your work, and following you for a long time, as are many, many, many people on the internet, despite the loudmouth neoliberals. And I guess I just wanted to ask you: do you ever consider yourself taking the dip and maybe considering a run for office?
It seems very unpleasant, doesn't it?
It does. I would never do it, but I also don't think I could win. I think you could win.
Well, look, even working for a campaign, I'm not someone who's like, I'm going to work in politics. And some people would say that's obvious because we don't think you did a good job. So fair enough. I was an attorney because I wasn't sure what I would like to do, but I like to argue, talk, and write. And when I got the job at The Intercept, I was thrilled because I never thought that I would be paid to write for my opinion and to be an editor. And it was like a wonderful experience for a year. And I got to learn so much from my colleagues there. And then when the campaign came knocking, it was tough for me because, it's not something I applied to do. And, I said to the senator, are you sure? Because I am a genuine progressive who works at, we don't have much in the world of left media, but probably the most legitimate, one of the most legitimate mainstream left outlets. And I'm Black. And I know the kind of attacks that you got in 2016. Are you sure it wouldn't be more beneficial to you just to have an independent journalist who happens to share your values out in the world, And, he said he wanted me to come on. So I came on. But for that, I don't think I would have sought out a political life at all. So I understand that politics often, requires politicians to have a certain kind of background and pedigree that is hard to come by, and that progressives find even more difficult to come by because there seems to, there's often a class overlap and a value overlap, and that for demographic reasons and a whole bunch of reasons, I'm well suited, and I take that potential responsibility seriously. But at this time, there is nothing that seems appealing about it.
No breaking news to Vanguard.
Yeah, all right.
No, sirs.
All right. Yeah, that's awesome. Did you want to ask her about Twin Peaks?
Well, I think it's hilarious that how often on Bad Faith you guys joke about lynch people, because I don't know if you know this. You actually are sitting with probably the foremost lynch person in left media. Gavin not only has a David Lynch related tattoo, but has a fucking shrine devoted to the man, has seen every single one of his movies. Is a devout Lynchian. And I just wanted to end this conversation with a little chit chat about Twin Peaks. What did you think about the show?
Okay, wait, Gavin, what's your tattoo?
Okay, well, I don't have a Twin Peaks tattoo. I have one design that I'm going to get. I have a BoJack tattoo that Zach might have.
You also have the Blue Velvet tattoo.
No, you're right. Okay, no, you're right, Zach. How do I forget my own tattoos? You're right. I have this Blue Velvet one, which is a quote from the film Blue Velvet. But yeah, Twin Peaks is also a tattoo I'm gonna get soon. It's gonna be like the bird from the opening. But yeah, I heard that you and Virgil were like joking around about that, and I just thought it was so funny.
So I started binging it last summer because COVID and unemployment. And I felt like, I listened to all of these left podcasts. And the point I was speaking to Virgil is that there's a certain culture of references that happens on a lot of these left podcasts that is very Brooklyn and a certain age and a certain demographic. And I want to know what they're joking about because those are the podcasts I like. So I consume a lot of the stuff that they reference. And so I did a good faith try at Twin Peaks. And I watched all of the first season and I pretty much enjoyed it. And then the second season
Lynch leaves the show halfway through the second season, and it just completely tanks. It
Do you not like the first part of the first season?
I didn't make it to halfway through the second season.
Yeah, it's so bad. It gets bad.
These are hour-long episodes. This is like a real commitment. There's like 24 of them a season. You want me to spend like 12 hours of my life getting to maybe just so I can watch, I guess, the third season, which everybody says is worth it.
Return is amazing. A game changer for American television.
It's so good.
I mean, I tried. I'm not saying I've given up on it forever. But I feel like I've watched enough.
Here's
to know
the real
what
strategy.
Lynchian.
Just skip to the last episode of season 2 and watch that, and then move on to season 3. You can fill in the rest.
I think you're gonna miss out on way too much if you do that way. But it does reward patience. But I do understand it not being for everyone too. So don't like try to force feed it to yourself or whatever.
Well, what movie should I watch in lieu of
Mulholland Drive?
Mulholland Drive. Yeah, I would say Mulholland Drive for sure, because Twin Peaks was still very much so a product of 90s television. It was he couldn't go like full auteur really with that project, whereas later on in his career he really did, and films like Mulholland Drive I think really represent that.
BBC voted it the best film of the millennium.
Yeah.
All right, I asked Virgil what's Mulholland Drive about, and he could not answer me.
It's a Hollywood story, right?
Think of it's about dreams and Hollywood. But it's really interesting. An
aspiring actress essentially moves to Hollywood and has some trouble, right? But he's exploring the dark underbelly of the entertainment industry. Essentially, it's a meditation on exploitation, corruption, that kind of thing.
Okay, I'm seeing that it's on HBO Max streaming, so I'm prepared to watch that. Well, probably not tonight because we have to do podcast edits tonight, but early next week.
I bet
we'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. And it's a very interesting movie. It's not one that you'll necessarily immediately get sucked into, but at the end of it, you'll be like, "What the fuck did I just watch? That was crazy." And it might redefine the way you think about movies. At least it did for me. I wasn't really that into art films until I saw that movie a couple of years or 5 years ago now. And it really did change my conception of cinema, but that's probably sounds like the most pretentious shit you've ever fucking heard.
Okay, Matt J is saying no. Turbo GG says it must be watched at least 3 times, which does not bode well.
Okay, well, it must be watched 3 times to understand it, maybe, but not to enjoy it. The first time I watched it, I enjoyed it just as much as every other time. I just didn't quite grasp what I had seen.
In true Lynch fashion, it's like, my film should be let you wash over you like a waterfall. You should not try and pick it apart. You should just experience the flow of things and the meditation of the film.
If you haven't heard David Lynch's voice, that probably didn't make all that much sense. But
I gotcha.
Okay, good.
But anyway, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was really awesome chatting with you.
It's my pleasure. And you guys are really great. There's a reason your content is blowing up. Your commentary is incisive and your rapport is really, really nice. And you're getting great guests. And I really enjoy seeing your little promo squares popping up on my feed. I'm a subscriber. Everyone listening should absolutely subscribe and support you too.
Well, that's surreal to hear. Thank you so much for the compliment. And thanks so much for joining us again. Truly, it was a great time for us.
My pleasure.
We truly appreciate it. Thanks so much. Have a great one. So yeah, that was fucking awesome. I can't believe Briahna Joy Gray watches the fucking Vanguard and subscribes. What the
I know, this is so lame to say, but over the course of the last 3 weeks, you kind of described it as your parents catching you with your hand in the cookie jar. It really just fucking feels like all these people that we've read and thought about and debated amongst ourselves in a decisive fashion. Now we just were like, fuck it, let's put this on the internet, and those people now engage with us. That is very, very strange, but obviously it was a fucking tremendous treat to get to speak to the Briahna Joy Gray herself. That was really fantastic. Not something that Gavin and I probably ever thought we would get to do. Thanks for everybody that tuned in.
Yeah, I had to, prevent myself from fanboying a few times there, but it was freaking awesome, especially talking about Twin Peaks with Briahna. That's not an experience I ever thought I would get to have. And by the way, that would be fucking crazy to get David Lynch on the podcast, if you're listening, David. But yeah, I guess before we go, once again, I'll shout out our patrons because we do like to do that at the beginning and ending of our live streams. And I'll remind you all that we just recently rolled out our Discord server. So if you want to be in the Vanguard community in the truest sense possible, that's probably the best way to do it. That's where the conversation is happening. It's really fun and we love to engage with our community. So again, thank you so much to everyone supporting us on Patreon. We're working on getting our van fixed right now. That's right. We have a Sprinter van, hence the Vanguard. We're going to be taking that out on the road here shortly to start making some documentaries and do some, citizen reporting, some backpack journalism. We need so much more of that right now. And Zach and I are willing to make it our lives work to do that kind of shit for you guys. So Again, if you want to support that work, then you can hit up that Patreon link. There's also a PayPal link in the description if you'd prefer to donate that way. I know some people have their issues with Patreon or Super Chat or whatever. So, we like to make it whatever you want to do. Or if not, that's also totally fine.
Yeah, you're all comrades in our hearts. Just hit the like button and the subscribe button so you can catch us the next time we go live. And we look forward to kicking it with you guys again soon.
Yeah, guys, it was awesome. And, just a huge shout out again to Briahna. Thank you so much for your time. And obviously, if you guys haven't, make sure to check out the Bad Faith podcast. It's one of the best shows on right now. Definitely one of my favorites. And thanks so much for the super chats. Everyone that, gave a super chat. It really does go appreciated, and it truly does help what we're working on here, our mission at the Vanguard, that's fueling it, to be honest. So yeah, thank you all. It's awesome. So have a great day, everyone. We'll be back tomorrow.
Yeah. Peace out, guys.